to all of you. Thank you so much for coming to this online event, a lecture series of ACES, the Amsterdam Center for European Studies. And this is the Diverse Europe group series. And at Diverse Europe, we organize all kinds of activities with visiting fellows and renowned speakers on diversity in the broadest sense of the word. I'm Liza Mugge. I'm one of the co-theme leaders, which gives me also the privilege to introduce our very special guest today, Professor Andrew Reynolds. He's a professor of political science at Princeton University, and he is also a visiting scholar with the Diverse Europe group this month. In his research and teaching, he focuses on democratization, constitutional design, and electoral politics. He wrote many books and many articles on a variety of topics, ranging from South African politics to the Arab Spring elections and the future of democracy. And at ACES, with us at Diverse Europe, he will mostly engage with us about his expertise and interest in the political presence and impact of minorities and marginalized communities. In the past years, I've used many of his articles on women and LGBTQ politicians in my courses. And during his last visit in 2018, Professor Reynolds opened the academic year of the Amsterdam Center for Research for Amsterdam Center for Gender and Sexuality Studies with a keynote on his latest book, The Children of Harvey Milk: How LGBTQ Politicians Changed the World. It was published by Oxford University Press in 2018. I admire Professor Reynolds not only for his academic work, but also for his engagement in policy advising and sharing his ideas and research widely with outlets like the New York Times, Washington Post, and The Guardian. He also founded a very cool initiative, Queer Politics at Princeton, where he collects and shares data on out LGBTQ plus elected officials globally. And he aims to facilitate discussion among students, scholars, and community leaders. And it features stories to inspire, and it's a great resource for scholars and students. And I would definitely recommend you to visit that website. Today, Professor Reynolds will share his latest research in the talk, The Gay Rights, Explaining Divergence in the Embrace of LGBTQ Rights Among Right-Wing Parties in the OSCE. Before I give the word to Professor Reynolds, I would like to ask you to turn on your camera if you feel comfortable. It's always nice for the speaker to see who's present, but mute yourself. We will record the lecture, but we will not record the Q&A. So after the talk, there is plenty of time to pose all kinds of questions to Professor Reynolds. Professor Reynolds, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And hopefully you can all hear me. Can you hear me, Lisa? Great. I really do appreciate you joining online today. I'm sorry that it's not in person. It would have been nice to walk a few hundred yards across the university. I'm just south of the university here and see you in person. But this is a fabulous opportunity nonetheless to interact with the University of Amsterdam and its ACES group and its focus on gender and sexuality. We've long admired the work of the department and across the campus on issues around identity and European and American politics. And Lisa is obviously one of the outstanding scholars that we look to in Europe, and it's really a pleasure to be here as well. Fantastic hosts, and I hope that this is the first of many trips where I get to come back and interact with you all. As Lisa said, focus on issues of identity, and I'm very interested increasingly in issues of LGBTQ politics and public policy. And that's what I'm focusing on at Princeton University. And I've been there for about a year and a half. You know, sometimes we present work that is published and it's out there. I'm going the other direction here, and I'm publishing work, presenting work that is not published and very much is in its infancy and very much is a brainstorming work in progress. So your feedback and any comments and questions you have will be greatly received. I would have sent you papers, at least an outline for you to look at, but frankly, frankly, all that it exists on right now is my whiteboard in the office, and that's too big to mail you. So the written version of this is not particularly extensive, but I think we have a lot of the ideas worked out that we're trying to fill in the evidential gaps for. This was put together by my co-author and I, Gabriele Magni. Gabriele is an Italian who studied in the United States, now teaches in California. And Gabriele and I have got this team partnership going where we like to work together on especially LGBTQ issues. And we publish work on a variety of international and American focuses on that area. So we were really thinking about this interesting phenomenon that I think a number of us have been aware of, but not necessarily have tried to unpack in a specific way. And that was the question of the increasing number of LGBTQ identifying politicians on the right of politics, the somewhat surprising embrace of LGBTQ equality issues on the right of politics, and perhaps even more surprisingly, the embrace of some lesbian and gay issues amongst parties that we might consider the radical right or the populist right, especially in Western Europe. All of those seeming counterintuitive to, you know, our old long-held views of partisanship and equality and sexual orientation and gender identity. So as you've seen here on this first slide, really what we're thinking about is trying to explain the fact that there are increasing numbers of out, self-identified, open LGBTQ parliamentarians and other elected officials from the right. That last year was starting to approach the number globally of parliamentarians elected from left of center parties. And some of those center-right parties, the parties that I'll delve into in a little bit more detail in a second, have sort of embraced lesbian and gay equality issues with an almost evangelical fervor. They are new believers. They are the converts to the cause, and their enthusiasm sometimes is quite bracing. We also find some circumstantial evidence. I mean, polling is not great, but we find that queer people in many countries are increasingly voting for right of center parties. Certainly not by majority, and certainly the left and post-materialist parties still monopolize the queer vote, but nevertheless, voters are voting for right of center parties in many democracies. And as I said, what's perhaps even more shocking is that some radical populist parties have embraced some version of gay rights. And that's another thing that we were trying to understand. But outside of Western Europe, some of those populist parties, the radical parties, especially in East and Central Europe, still vehemently, viscerally, substantively, rhetorically oppose gay rights and the gay community and LGBTQ and queer politics. Not unsurprisingly, Christian parties, those parties still heavily associated with religiosity and the church, remain opposed to gay rights by and large. And also, I think it's true to say, and I'll make this argument in a little bit more detail, the extent of the embrace of lesbian and gay equality has not stretched to the embrace or even a connection to trans and gender non-conforming rights. That transgender and non-binary and gender non-conforming people are still largely shut out of a right-wing embrace of lesbian and gay rights. And again, we were interested to see why that should be the case. And you know, some of the things that really sparked this in my brain is, even though I'm living in America and have done for nearly 30 years, I'm still sadly British from London, and I cannot throw that away. And my Britishness comes out with my obsession of British politics. And one of the biggest changes, being a queer man growing up in the United Kingdom and now watching life today as a 50-something person, is the fact that the Conservative Party under David Cameron really did substantively change the way in which the British government considered equality in the field of lesbian and gay rights. And David Cameron came out for same-sex marriage in the United Kingdom. He basically forced it through a not completely enthusiastic parliamentary party from his side. And he used his political capital to actually make it happen. And that was a big deal for the country and a big deal for him. And the other points that, you know, have sort of energized this question in our mind was the development of radical right populist parties like the Swedish Democrats, who very explicitly embrace gay and lesbian rights and couple that with their anti-immigration stance, Islamophobia, and are using rhetoric that today includes lesbian and gay people as part of their core, mostly white, nationalism. And that even stretches to the French National Front, who are picking up increasingly gay, especially gay male and bisexual male votes in France. And as I said, one of the interesting things about the data, and my center attempts to keep as much of the data as we can on out parliamentarians globally. And actually, I should tell you that we have a new website which will launch just after the holidays, and that has all of our data points about elected officials above the city council level, so state representatives, mayors, parliamentarians, cabinet ministers, and anon. And we have over 1,000 individuals, and that database will be searchable by the map, and then you can download it and search it in any way you want to. And we think that's a great resource. And what we find from that resource is that, as you can see, the blue line on this graph, the number of out LGBTQ parliamentarians, explicitly out, not those in the closet, we don't count those, but the number of out parliamentarians from the conservative, from the right side, has increased at a higher rate than the left. And they're not quite the same, they're not at the same level, but there has been a substantive growth in queer or LGBTQ politicians on the right. If you lived in America all the time and never looked at any other news, you would think that there's no partisan support for LGBTQ politicians on the right because the Republicans are so anti that. But in the rest of the world, especially in Europe and in South America, you see a number of right of center politicians. You can see also that dotted black line, we have a small but growing number of out politicians in the radical right, in the populist right, the National Front, the Front National, the Swedish Democrats, other Western European parties that now have members in their cohort who are out politicians. And interestingly, and I don't know if he's online or not, but one of my heroes, Koos Hysen, who was the first out elected official anywhere in the world, and he should be heralded as he is being done for that. And he's probably a few hundred yards or a couple of miles away from us here today. You know, he actually was elected for a center-right party. The CHU at the time, the party that he was a member of, was obviously considered to be somewhere on the center and the right. And so this phenomenon is not entirely unique. And at the same time as the coupling of the growing number of right of center politicians and the growing embrace of equality to some degree. We see that legal rights for gay and lesbian and bisexual people are taking off throughout the OECD. So I don't need to go through all the details with many of you who are experts on this, but as you all know, we are seeing issues around employment discrimination, we're seeing issues around hate crime law, we're seeing marriage and civil unions, we're seeing the equalization of discriminatory laws around housing, trying to counter bullying in schools, harassment. There are increasing legislative trends to actually equalize the treatment of straight and non-straight people in much of the OECD. And that's probably most manifest in the issue of marriage. As you can see, and as you know, Western European countries have largely embraced marriage equality. And then some of the Central and Southern and Eastern European countries are to some extent moving in that direction. But the level of equality in the eastern part of Europe and parts of the OECD are definitely lagging far behind. And as you can see from the ILGA's data, when you look at the enlargement of the European Union, the founding members and the first enlargement groups, the first, second, third, and even the fourth, primarily from Western Europe and Scandinavia, are the front runners in equality in LGBTQ legislation. You can see that the fifth enlargement, including mostly Eastern European countries, the sixth and the seventh, are actually much more regressive in terms of equality. And with the exceptions of Malta and Croatia, those countries are basically in that Eastern Central European mold of blocking, by and large, equality issues. But at the same time, we're not just seeing politicians on the back benches who are out politicians. We're seeing leaders, which to me is more than just another data point. The symbolic signaling of making or accepting your leader of your radical or center-right party, almost allowing the space for them to be an out gay man or a lesbian woman or a bisexual man, is a significant signaling of the values, or at least the strategy of your party. So obviously we have people like Leo Varadkar, who is currently the Tanistay, but used to be the Taoiseach in Ireland, and he is once and future Taoiseach. He will be the Prime Minister again next year. Per Christian Foss in Norway, Christian Democrat, was very briefly an acting Prime Minister, but Finance Minister. Tobias Billström in Sweden, a bisexual man in the Moderate Party. And then obviously the radical right has had its histories of open out leadership. Even your own Pim Fortuyn in the Netherlands, in France, in the National Front, the radical parties in Austria, and Søren Pape Poulsen in Denmark, and then, you know, remarkably, the leader of the alliance, the Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD, is an out lesbian, Alice Weidel. So we're seeing the signaling of spaces opening up. But when you look at the bigger picture, and this is a table in progress, so I am more than prepared for somebody to complain to me that a party needs to be moved from column to column. And obviously I can share, and I'm more than happy for the university and ACES to share this PowerPoint slide with anybody who would like it. I can send it to you if you'd like to look at it in more detail. But basically what we've tried to do here is start looking at the right-wing parties of the OECD and basically look at the center right, which overwhelmingly now to a large degree embrace gay rights. Look at the Christian right, those parties that are still heavily attached to the church, that they base their credibility, their legitimacy, and their electorate is based on religiosity, people going to church, saying that they are religious, whether it's Catholicism or Protestantism, whatever it may be. those parties still are religious parties. And then in the middle, and those parties still diametrically opposed to gay rights. And then in the middle, you have the radical populist right. And what we find interesting is a split down the middle between the radical populist right, who embrace to some extent gay rights, and the radical right, who are still viscerally opposed to gay rights. And you'll notice that I'm constantly using the phrase gay rights, because I don't want to murky the picture with transgender rights or even bisexual rights, because most of our populist radical party cases, whilst they are embracing gay and lesbian rights to a large degree, they do not embrace transgender rights or gender non-conforming rights or other gender identity issues. So we're focused here on issues of gay and lesbian populations and their legal rights. So we see basically center right pretty much pro, Christian right pretty much anti, the radical right split down the middle. And of course, if you look at that table, you immediately start to think, well, what's going on here? What are the variables splitting the radical right down the middle? And we'll get to that. And as I say, we're introducing this as a sort of a broad picture idea. We're going to gather more evidence for campaigning and for legislation. But I want to lay out to you the theory and the hypotheses that go behind our analysis of what's going on here. And I would say that the reason that the center right have largely moved to a point of accepting gay and lesbian relationships and codifying them in law is that they have managed to detach themselves from the church. Think about Fianna Gael, think about Fianna Fáil in Ireland. Think about other Western European, Dutch, Danish, Belgian parties, the British Conservative Party. They are no longer the party at prayer. They are no longer the party that is so attached to the church and religious followers that they need to pander or reflect the views of their congregations. I think it's also true to say that a lot of centre-right parties, and this is certainly the case in the British Conservative Party, see queer inclusion, lesbian and gay inclusion, as a signal of their modernity, of their softer edges. They no longer are the nasty, mean party, unkind party. Their inclusion of gay and lesbian voters and policies and elected officials sort of is deliberately supposed to cue a feeling of empathy and understanding and burnish off the rough edges of their economic policies. And it's also true to say that the evidence that we've found, Gabriella and I have found, and others that I'll point to in a little while, is that homophobia in many places for the center-right is counterproductive as a strategy. It just doesn't win you votes anymore. There are lots of places where it's foolhardy to go after the gays because it actually doesn't help you among the straight population. People find it alienating, they find it aggressive, and also if a previously homophobic person was voting on gay rights and against gay rights, today they are much more ambivalent about the issue. They may still be uneasy about gay people, but it's a 12th or 13th or 15th order of magnitude in their rationale, their decision-making function. They become more ambivalent. And the interesting thing for the center-right is that it's very much a focalization on the normalization of gay people, the normalization of the queer community, the assimilation. And that's obviously a big issue within the queer community, but conservative parties that are on the center-right, that are more secular, are today saying, we support marriage because we like the traditional views of parents with 2 children, 3 children. We like the stability of the traditional family structure, and now we can say that the 2 women or the 2 men can have that traditional family structure. So it's not about bringing in the queer, it's about bringing in the gay person. I once had a conservative researcher in the British Parliament say to me, You can be as gay as you want in this place, just don't be queer, which is very true. The conservatives see this as a normalization strategy. And as I said, we have some evidence, and Gabrielle and I have done some work that you can look up. A few years ago, we had a piece in the APSR, and I think the JOP piece is actually out now, but we've done some work on what is the voter bias, all else being equal, against gay candidates. And, you know, we're finding, and this is from a few years ago, and a conjoint experiment about the effect of identity upon voting behavior. And we're finding that, yes, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and also in France and New Zealand, which I'm not showing here, there is a penalty for gay candidates, all else being equal. But there's a bigger penalty for a trans candidate. There's a bigger penalty for a candidate who's overweight with diabetes. There's a bigger penalty for a candidate who's HIV positive. There's a bigger penalty for a candidate who is over 70 years of age. And certainly there's a bigger penalty for a candidate who is Muslim in those two countries. So we're finding the waning of impact of penalty that is still there. But if you look at those three countries, all else being equal, we had a very large conjoint experiment. We found that the penalties were relatively constrained for just being gay on the ballot paper. But more importantly than the overall is unpacking the overall. And where is this penalty coming from? The penalty in all of those three cases, and I'm sure it would be the same in the Netherlands if we measured it, is coming from conservatives. They do not like the candidate being gay. You have a significant penalty. There is no penalty coming from the progressives, from the left, in any of these countries. In fact, we had a statistically significant result that in New Zealand, because it's New Zealand, being gay helped you. You got a bonus, all else being equal. In fact, women, lesbians in New Zealand got an even bigger bonus because it's New Zealand and they're perfect in every way. So you can see that this is very much a phenomenon, not of the electorate as a whole, but on the right. But it's also interesting to say that when you unpack the reasons behind that vote discrimination, that penalty, and we were asking respondents about, did the gay candidate pose a threat to traditional values? Was the gay candidate a sign of progress? Was the gay candidate cueing that he was a left-leaning candidate? Just because you're gay, they assume you're on the left. Or was there outright prejudice? And we measure that by classic questions like, would you like a gay person to marry your child? Or would you like a neighbor who's gay? We found that in the United States, at least, and the other countries mirrored this, that amongst Democrat voters, there was very little penalty based on prejudice. If there was any penalty, it was about electability. And electability means I myself am not homophobic, but I know the rest of the country is, and my neighbors are, so I'm not going to waste my vote on the gay candidate, let's say Pete Buttigieg, because he can't win. I know that I, all else being equal, quite like this candidate, but then just not electable. And of course, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If a candidate who is LGBTQ stands, they are presumed not to be able to win, then people don't vote for them, so they don't win. So next time, everybody presumes they can't win, and it's a cycle. There was more discrimination amongst Republican respondents, but still, the most important factor there was electability. And if we go into the center-right issue a little bit more, it reflects this desire to use the lesbian and gay issue as a new form of conservative traditionalism, almost heteronormative behavior. Cameron literally said, I don't support gay marriage despite being a conservative. I support gay marriage because I'm a conservative. And then when he left office, gay marriage was considered by the British public to be his greatest achievement. Literally, amongst all the other fabulous things he did, like causing Brexit, sorry, there's a heavy lace of irony in my voice, Gay marriage was considered to be his crowning glory. And in fact, Cameron believes that himself as well. And that's a remarkable thing, because let us not forget, when I was a kid in South London, the Conservative Party under Margaret Thatcher said gay people were an abomination. HIV was a plague brought by the queers to destroy the nation. You don't want to be in the queer militant camp, and you certainly don't want to teach your children about gayness. Section 28 of 1987 said it was illegal to teach children in school about gay or lesbian relationships. It was unnatural. The British government was incredibly homophobic, and that led to a legacy of awful outcomes for a lot of gay people in Britain. But let's go to today, or at least last year. Right now, there's I think 85 out members of the British Palace of Westminster, and they're mostly conservative. I mean, there's a massive cohort. In some ways, they're way overrepresented in the British House of Commons. There are 56 members of Parliament. There are another 20 plus members of the House of Lords from every party, from the Conservatives, from Labour, the Scottish Nationalists, from the Liberal Democrats and independent crossbenchers in the House of Lords. The Conservative Party is now heavily invested in out lesbian, gay, bisexual politicians. And you can see that they've overtaken the Labour Party in their representation over time. And that matters, because when things like same-sex marriage are debated, conservatives can stand up and say, this is me. You're now voting on me and my rights. The Christian right, again, we don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but the Christian right, I think entirely understandably, have not detached themselves from the church, and thus have not detached themselves from homophobia. That they still campaign in such a way that they exclude lesbian and gay people. And they may be slightly less vitriolic about it today, but they still are deeply uneasy with equality. I do like the little ad here for the Christian Union, a party that you know a lot better than I, because it basically says that you can come and be a politician, but you also are doing Bible studies. But whatever your beliefs are, you are very welcome to join us. I would like to test that, but we'll see. And then on the other photograph shows demonstrations against the Mexican same-sex marriage legislation in progress by the Mexican PAN, by the PAN, more Christian right party in Mexico. So we're seeing the religious right hang on to their opposition. And that is not surprising either. If you look at the polling that Gabrielle and I did on religiosity, you can see that if you're not religious in our pool, in the United States, UK, and New Zealand, there's no significant penalty to gay candidates. If you're religious, there's a significant penalty. And so that brings us on to the US grand old party, the Republican Party. I don't need to go through with you, hopefully, the litany of anti-LGBTQ legislation that the US Republican Party has performed over the last half a dozen years, not just at the federal level, but at the state level as well. Vitriolic anti-LGBTQ legislation. This photograph is somewhat of an ironic illustration of Trump's performance in the White House when it came to LGBTQ people. And, you know, we could actually have an argument about whether the GOP should be within the religious right column or the radical populist right column, because they also mix a lot of the xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-immigration policies within that as well. Which is ironic because the US queer voting population is massively taking off. 3 different national polls in the last presidential election found that the LGBTQ share of the US vote was about 10%. 10%. None of this, oh, 4.5% of America is queer. 10% of voters, which came out in our survey to around about 13 million Americans. And you can see that was predominantly bisexual, pansexual Americans who self-identify that way. And the majority of those are women. Bi women are now the largest share of the queer vote within the United States. And when you look at their party identification, straights split 3 ways between Democrats, Independents, and Republicans. The LGBTQ population are majority Democratic, a significant third being Independents, and a very small slice of 10% being Republican members or registered Republicans. So no one in the United States on the right is reaching out to LGBTQ voters. And we would say the religiosity of that party, the beholdenness to evangelical Christians, still blocks any outreach to the LGBTQ community. But then let's get to the third and last grouping, the middle grouping, the radical populist grouping. And as I said, we've got a bunch of parties who are at least rhetorically sympathetic, and I don't want to overplay this. I know that these parties are not gung-ho for all equality, but there are parties that do believe in some degree of equality for lesbian and gays within their country, especially the majority white groups within their country. And so, you know, whether it's Geert Wilders, or whether it's the Swedish Democrats, or whether it's ancestors of Pim Fortuyn, or whether it's some of the Norwegian or Danish parties, you have a very explicit embrace of gay rights as a form of national identity. And the argument here is that it has got to the point where groups on the right in the Netherlands or Denmark or Sweden can say, our national identity, our traditionalism is gay rights. That's who we are as the Dutch. And the influx of Muslims, the influx of the brown, the influx of the other, the influx of the Jew perhaps, the influx of the immigrant injures our traditional values. And remarkably, traditional values now include gay and lesbian rights. And so this strategy is clearly, sometimes it's more obvious than others, certainly with the Swedish Democrats it is clearly very used as a club to beat back the Muslim immigrants. And by extraction, by connection, the non-white also is attached to that Muslim smear. It's a form of homo-nationalism. But then on the other side, you have the viscerally opposed radical right parties, the Orbans, the Poles, the Estonians, who see LGBTQ rights as a foreign notion that is being insinuated into Poland or Hungary. They don't see it as an indigenous value. They see it as a value that is being pushed upon them by the immoral West. And there, and obviously as we've seen with Poland and Hungary, they are vitriolically using homophobia and transphobia as a means of signaling their indigenous nationalism. The opposite, effectively, of the people in the Netherlands and Denmark and Sweden. And that's also wrapped up with nationalism being part of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Even while Orban is like Trump, that he's not really religious, the alliance between the church and its homophobia and the nationalism and its homophobia is an important part of that discussion. So one of your great scholars, Cas Morda, talks about the radical right being short on principle and long on opportunism. And that's true in this case. And even Pim Fortuyn early on was talking about the fact that Islamic culture was backwards, and therefore it was a threat to women and the LGBTQ community. And his legacy has actually played out in other places. And what that means, and I'm sorry this slide is blurry, but what that means is that these radical right and center-right parties are actually now getting a share, not just of the straight anti-Muslim vote, but they're getting a share of the LGBTQ vote as well. The evidence and data isn't great, but what we have says that the French National Front, the Alliance for Deutschland, the Alternative for Deutschland, even Bolsonaro in Brazil and the US Republicans are getting a share, perhaps more than expected, of queer voters in their countries, voters who are afraid perhaps of the migrants. And Caroline Lancaster, who's a graduate student at the University of North Carolina, has done a study about where is this coming from in the radical right? And she finds, based on really interesting data, that the radical right voters, especially of Western Europe, are basically of three types. Conservative nativists, older, more likely to be men, liking traditional family and strong governments, very opposed to immigration and European immigration. And then she finds an increasing body of what they call sexually modern nativists. So they're younger, they're more highly educated, they're more likely to be women, and they do not oppose egalitarianism and LGBTQ rights. The moderate nativists are somewhere in the middle. But over time, as you can see from this slide, the number of the sexually modern nativists, those Swedish Democrat voters, those Geert Wilders voters, those French National Front voters, are increasingly becoming younger, sexually modern nativists, where LGBTQ rights is no longer a wedge issue for them. And in fact, by and large, they're more supportive. So it makes sense for the radical right in those countries to support. But as I said, the radical right in Poland, in Hungary, in other parts in Central and Eastern Europe, and we have a slide here of the radical right in Estonia, those people are very explicitly selling their homophobia on the basis of it being blocking the foreign import of immorality into their Polish, Catholic, Hungarian, Eastern Orthodox societies. So that's really is sort of what's mirroring this split between gay marriage being successful in Western Europe and Scandinavia and gay marriage being way, way behind in Central and Eastern European countries. And let me close, because I know I've spoken for about 40 minutes, but let me close with this brief discussion of why the T doesn't go with the LGB on the right, why transgender rights are not incorporated in amongst any of these groups, not even the more progressive center-right, secular, conservative parties who are good on lesbian and gay rights are basically working well on transgender rights. In fact, I'll be off to London at the end of this week, and London is riven with a British Conservative government that has totally dropped the ball on transgender rights and is in the midst of a terrible debate between those opposed to trans rights and gender identity understandings and those who are trying to push for basic rights similar to lesbian and gay rights. The Conservative government have failed to do their job on trans rights, but they have, we must say, been very good on lesbian and gay rights within legislation over the last decade. And what's going on there? Well, partly, I think, like gay and lesbians 30, 40, 50 years ago, there's an issue of visibility and familiarity. The trans community is smaller and they're more invisible, often for very good reason that trans people do not make themselves visible because it is a vulnerable situation. So we or they or people do not know the trans person. You're not likely to have the trans person as your daughter or your parent or your lover. You're not likely to know the trans person as your colleague in the workplace, and you're certainly not likely to have the trans person as a visible representative on your screen or in your parliament. Obviously now we have the remarkable addition of trans members of parliament in the Netherlands and in Germany and in a few other countries, but that is the brand new experience of trans people front and center in our eye line of legitimacy. And trans inclusion doesn't win votes from moderates. Trans inclusion is not like lesbian and gay inclusion, which now appeals to moderates at this stage, because it's not yet seen as a national value. Nobody in Denmark and the Netherlands or Sweden is saying, well, yes, transgender equality is also our national value. No one is saying that, because it is frankly not the national value. And, you know, we have these remarkable polls and surveys of visibility. This is from the United States and is from 5 years ago, when in the United States, more people in America said that they had seen a ghost than had seen a transgender person. That is not a good indicator of visibility. Now, that has changed. Over time, now, more people are saying that they've met a transgender person, but it's still very, very low compared to the number of people who say, I know a gay or lesbian person, or the number of people who say, I have a family member or a friend who is gay and lesbian. Actually, a totally side issue, the number of people in America who know somebody who is HIV positive has actually declined. And that is problematic because whilst the medical treatment of HIV has reached an exceptionally good level of management, what that means is that HIV people no longer need necessarily to be visible with their HIV. And so HIV visibility has declined at the same time as attention still needs to be placed upon issues around HIV and AIDS, especially globally. And it's also true that trans people are not part of this equation because they are much more likely to be discriminated against when it comes to the ballot. If you remember, our figures for gays and lesbians in the United States, UK, and New Zealand were ranging between 6 and 3% penalty, more than doubled for transgender candidates against cisgender candidates in our survey. And again, progressives are not carrying the water on this issue. Progressives are not the ones doing the discrimination. Even progressives are by and large as likely to vote for a trans candidate if they thought they could win as a cisgender candidate. But there is a massive penalty amongst all conservatives across the board in those three established democracies. And I'm sure we would find the same in other established democracies. Which is ironic, and I'm nearly done with this, but it's ironic because, again, we have so little data on this. But when you start to unpack the L, the G, the B, and the T, they don't all vote the same way. We assume that queers are all queer and they're all queering voting the same way. It is not true. Lesbians vote in the United States predominantly for Democrats and very few for Republicans. Gay men vote overwhelmingly for Democrats, a little bit more for Republicans. Bi and pansexual Americans are actually slightly more likely to vote for Republicans and slightly less likely to vote for Democrats, and many more of them identify as independents. Now, they're sort of classically, stereotypically putting themselves in the middle, those bi people, and I speak as one of those middlers myself. But then look at the trans and gender non-conforming electorate. We actually had a big enough survey to get some purchase on this. And the interesting thing is it's somewhat of a bimodal distribution. You have trans voters on the extreme left, and you have the trans voters on the extreme right. You have more conservative trans voters than any other of the queer population. And I think what's going on in there is some degree of libertarianism, that gender identity is a libertarian issue and it's coupled with other libertarian issues that seem to be on the right. But certainly the trans community, all else being equal, should be more receptive to the right than the lesbian, gay, and bisexual. But of course, those right-wing parties are not incorporating them. So to close, let me just sum up what we think we're finding out of this survey, and we want to explore more. And I want to discuss with you about what you think about this. Xenophobia and Islamophobia is merged with the populist radical right parties that see effectively white supremacy as their raison d'etre, and they can use gay rights as part of their Islamophobia. The irony is that the center-right conservative parties began to adopt gay rights, and when they did, it became a cross-cutting core national identity, which then allowed the radical right to call it a core national identity and then exploit it for its own uses. It's ironic that the center, the seculars, the more moderate conservatives actually laid the groundwork for the radical right to then use it as a trope against immigrants. But the radical right does not embrace gay rights or lesbian rights when it's seen as a foreign value, and it's seen as a foreign value in those countries of Eastern Europe and more Catholic and Eastern Orthodox religiosity, where it is very much a foreign value. Of course, it's not a foreign value, it's just perceived to be by the right. And finally, you really need to detach your Conservative Party from the church. You need to be Fianna Gael. You need to be the British Conservative Party to create the space for LGBTQ inclusion within your policies and your parliamentary caucuses. If you maintain religiosity, for whatever reason, that puts a block on moving on this issue. And it also seems, just obvious, but the division between the religious and the secular conservative parties is so dramatic that I think it's important to state that it is the thing that drives differences between the embrace of equality on these issues.